charged with giving a nuanced look at the Emancipation Proclamation. So the first question that I'm going to pose to Professor Foner is to talk about the misconceptions that we often have about this document. So, Eric, what are the public's most common and concerning misconceptions about the Emancipation Proclamation?
Okay. First of all, let me just say I'm happy to be here at this great institution. And it's an unusual situation in that some years ago, I can't remember what year, I sat on the orals exam committee of Julie, and we spent 2 hours asking her questions. Now she has a chance to get back.
And I have some doozies.
Right. So the Emancipation Proclamation is one of the most important documents in American history, as you all know, and also one of the most misunderstood. There are many misconceptions about it, and I will just mention a couple of key ones. Number one, the first two are sort of the opposites. One is that Lincoln freed all the slaves with the stroke of his pen on the Emancipation Proclamation. This is not true. Even if you just look at the document, you'll see that there are exemptions, quite a few exemptions of areas that the proclamation does not apply to. There were about a little under 4 million slaves in the United States when the Civil War began. I should mention that that is the largest slave society in history. Maybe the Roman Empire may have had more, but slavery there was different. But this was a gigantic institution. It was far more powerful, wealthy, and important than any other slave institution of the modern world, this Old South. So 4 million slaves. The proclamation does not apply, first of all, to what they call the 4 border states. 4 slave states remained in the Union when the Civil War took place. 11 seceded to form the Confederacy, but the upper states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union. Since the proclamation is directed against the Confederacy, it has nothing to do with the states that are still in the Union, and indeed, their slavery is still protected by the U.S. Constitution, as slavery had always been. That's about, 500,000 slaves right there that are just not covered. Then I know that this document has been passed around. If you look at, the 5th paragraph on the first page, you will see a whole lot of other places, counties, parishes. Lincoln lists the states to which the proclamation applies, but with exceptions, except some parts of Louisiana, except some parts of Virginia. Those are areas where slavery continues also. Why he exempted them is an interesting question we can get to. All told, maybe about 750,000 slaves were just not covered by the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's the first myth, that all the slaves were just freed. There's an opposite myth, which is that the proclamation didn't actually free any slave on the day it was issued. The argument of that being that it only applied to Confederate territory, to areas under Confederate control, and it could not be enforced. By definition, it could not be enforced in areas under Confederate control. So at least on the day it was issued, it is said, no slaves were freed at all, because it's a statement, but it has no actual practical bearing. That's not true either, actually, because there were a few parts of the Confederacy under Union control that were not exempted. For example, the Sea Islands of South Carolina, which had been occupied by the Union Navy pretty close to the beginning of the war, and where there were maybe 50 or 60,000 slaves behind Union lines, Lincoln did not exempt that area. So those slaves did become free immediately on January 1st, 1863. And there were some others in some areas. It's a little hard to figure out, but some areas of maybe northern Mississippi or Arkansas, some other. Nobody knows. But this is what Lincolnites, or as somebody called it, the Lincoln Industrial Complex. This is what we do when we get together. We debate these things. How many slaves you think got freed on January 1st? 50,000, 60,000, 70,000. Nobody exactly knows,
But
but
the
it was some.
estimates are what, 20 to
100,
60,000? I mean,
something.
that's not a small.
It's not small.
an insignificant number of people.
It's not small, but compared to 4 million slaves,
Certainly.
it's pretty small. So, but more to the point is the implication of the proclamation for the war itself and for the future of slavery. To judge it on the basis of what happened just on January 1st, 1863, is misleading. Then there are many other mythologies we can go into. Again, opposite mythologies. One, Lincoln did not care about slavery at all. He just did this as a military measure. There's some truth in that, but not a lot. The opposite myth, Lincoln was a secret abolitionist. He was born with a pen in his hand, ready to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. He just had to wait until the right moment. In other words, this was something that he had been planning to do for years or something like that. That's also not true. So once we sweep away all those myths, then we can get down to what it really is.
Yeah, I would add another misconception, which is just simply what emancipation is.
All right, good point.
Today we sort of take for granted that with a stroke of a pen he freed, either 4 million or 20,000 or no slaves. But there were many kinds and many visions of emancipation. And actually, it's quite important for us as New Yorkers to think about this because there was gradual emancipation, something that Lincoln was an enormous fan of. Let's very slowly get rid of slavery over time. Let's compensate slaveholders. Colonization. Who in here has heard of what colonization? Who has heard of colonization?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so colonization is the idea that we would free enslaved people, and then we would promptly ship them out of the country because this country simply couldn't handle the idea of free black people living among white people. And Lincoln toyed with all of these ideas right up to the Emancipation Proclamation. So the idea that this was just let's free everybody uncompensated immediately was a very contested one at the time.
Yes, that's a very good point. And to go back to your initial point just now, emancipation, the end of slavery, the destruction of slavery in the United States, is not a single moment, not a single document, not a single person. It is a complicated historical process which took a lot of time. Even within the framework of the Civil War itself, it begins at the beginning of the Civil War. Emancipation is not actually complete until December 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is declared ratified. Slavery survived in Kentucky and Delaware all the way up months after Lincoln was dead.
And Delaware had how many slaves?
1,800, more or less.
1,800
Well,
slaves.
at that point, probably most of them had run away by then. There were hardly any, but they still waited, those are two border states to which the proclamation didn't apply.
So let's take up that question a little bit. When does emancipation begin?
Right.
Do we go back to 1861? Do we go back to 1776?
Jamestown, well, one could say emancipation begins when slavery begins, in the sense that slaves are running away from slavery from the beginning, fugitive slaves, So there are people emancipating themselves all throughout the history of slavery. But that doesn't end the institution of slavery. That just frees individual people. I think if you look at the civil, and then of course emancipation begins in the North, as Julie said, in the era of the American Revolution. Every colony, every one of the original 13 colony states had slavery. There was no such thing as free states and slave states. They were all slave states. Slavery was much bigger in the South, but New York had plenty of slavery. After the Revolution, this line is drawn, very slowly, but it's drawn between the free states and the slave states. So you could say emancipation begins when the northern states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York is one of the later ones, 1799, adopt mostly these gradual plans. Slavery in New York doesn't end actually until 1827. It's a long time. But so that's the beginning. And although to us those measures look rather mealy-mouthed, it is important to note that those are the first political institutions in modern history that actually abolished slavery. the first polities, the first states that actually abolished the institution of slavery where it existed were the northern states after the Revolution. So you have to give them credit for that. In the Civil War, one might say, we were talking about this, emancipation begins with General Benjamin Butler, who was later became famous or infamous for his behavior in New Orleans, which some of you may have heard of. He's not very popular in New Orleans. You don't know this probably, but our colleague Professor Paxton, you remember him, the French historian,
Yeah.
is married to a descendant of General Benjamin Butler,
That's remarkable.
Sarah Plimpton, whose mother is the president of the Butler Society.
That's great.
Again, they don't have a branch in New Orleans, but they're popular. They're
very
popular in Massachusetts. Anyway, I'll stop with this. Butler, in the spring, it was soon after the war begins, in the spring of 1861, slaves begin running away to Fortress Monroe, which is held by the Union around in Norfolk, or in that area of Virginia. And Butler says, I'm not sending these guys back. I'm going to keep them here because they are working. These are slaves. Their labor is going to help the Confederate Army. Why should I send them back to work against my army? That's absurd. I'll put them to work here. Here's a shovel. Go dig fortifications for me. And he declares them, he invents this concept that they are what he calls contraband of war. This is has no legal merit whatsoever. Contraband is goods on neutral ships that can
other countries.
of other countries that can be seized by belligerents if they have military value. In other words, the British are shipping cannons to the South. The Union can seize those as contraband of war. Butler says, well, these are property. These men are property. That's what they are. They're working for the Confederate Army. Therefore, they're contraband of war, and I can seize them. This breaks down completely when women, children, all sorts of people, once the word is out, hey, you can get your freedom by going to Fortress Monroe, people start going to Fortress Monroe. And most of those people are not working for the Confederate Army. Butler sends a note up to the cabinet and says, well, can I do this? And this is one of Lincoln's, a good example of Lincoln's sort of political savvy. Lincoln does not send an answer. The Secretary of War, Cameron, sends an answer to Butler which simply says, your policy is approved. It doesn't say who approved it.
Or if it's legal.
It doesn't say it's legal. It is approved. By whom? It doesn't even say Lincoln, the Secretary of War, the Cabinet, the Congress. So one could say that's the beginning, the little beginning of emancipation, in that it demonstrates that the presence of the Union Army is going to destabilize slavery. Whatever the policy of the government, slaves understand that when an occupying army turns up, the power relation has shifted in the South. And even though they can then seek their own advantage by going to the new power system that exists. So you give Butler the benefit of the glory of launching this in a very, very small way.
And I think, and we'll get a little bit more into this later, but I think this is a really key moment because it brings us to a question that Professor Foner and others have been answering for their whole careers of who freed the slaves.
Who freed the slaves?
And if we think about it the way that Professor Foner is talking about it, it's actually enslaved people who are really risking their lives, risking their families, risking their safety to emancipate themselves, to push for their own emancipation in a way that will eventually make an influence on the White House.
I think the question, who freed the slaves, is one that has many, many answers, right? Everybody freed the slaves. Slaves freed themselves. The army freed the slaves. Politicians freed the slaves. Abolitionists freed the slaves. Lincoln freed the slaves. There is no one answer to that question.
But as we see these quote-unquote contraband of war coming into forts like Fort Monroe, it becomes increasingly clear in Washington, right, the impact that this kind of policy is going to actually have on the outcomes of the war.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing you could say is the actions of these slaves are forcing the slavery issue onto the national agenda. At the beginning of the war, as I'm sure you know, Lincoln did not want slavery to be the key question. He had these 4 slave states in the Union. He was desperate to keep them from seceding. He said, if I lose Kentucky, I'm going to lose the war. if Kentucky and Maryland, Delaware, I hope no one's here from Delaware, but it's a tiny little weird place. And even Lincoln understood that, so he didn't care about Delaware. But Maryland and Kentucky, if they seceded, the Confederacy's border would come right up to the Ohio River, to Pennsylvania. The Confederacy is already as big as Western Europe. Conquering an area that big is not so easy. So Lincoln was desperate to keep the border states in, and he understood, if I start attacking slavery, those slave states are going to leave. So that's in the beginning of the war, there is this effort to keep slavery out of the issue.
All right, so we're in the South. We have more and more enslaved people coming to Union lines. Let's move up a little bit. Let's maybe come up to Brooklyn. Brooklyn, 1862, 1863. Right. What is going on in the lives of a Northerner? What does a Northerner do when they open the Brooklyn Eagle?
Well, the Brooklyn Eagle is a Democratic newspaper,
Maybe
right?
not the Brooklyn Eagle.
But that's an important point. That is an important point. You know, people today think, with justice, that our politics is very partisan, that people are always insulting each other, making extreme statements against each other. Yes, the spectacle in Washington is not very uplifting. However, the spectacle 150 years ago was also not uplifting. The press was much more partisan then. I mean, you were a Democratic newspaper or a Republican newspaper. And the Democratic papers were denouncing Lincoln in the most extreme. He was a guerrilla. He was an idiot. He was a simple despot. Susan. Yeah. And so if you picked up the Brooklyn Eagle, you would read the war was a disaster, the North was going to lose, it had no point, there were casualties, were pointless, we should just let them go, or no, actually they wouldn't say let them go, they would say negotiate an end to the war. If you picked up a Republican newspaper in Brooklyn, or if you picked up the New York Tribune from across the river, you would have Horace Greeley saying, emancipate, emancipate. That is the way to win the war. Free the slaves, free the slaves. Why isn't Lincoln was also being attacked by the Tribune on the grounds he was not radical enough. He was too slow. He was not using all the power in his office to attack the underpinnings. It is slavery that keeps these armies in the field for the Confederacy, you know. So there was deep, deep partisan division, even though there was a great deal of patriotism, of course. You know, people had enlisted in large numbers. But by 1862, the war, any notion that this was a romantic war full of glory was pretty much gone. This was a horrible, bloody war with unprecedented casualties, and enlistment was waning very, very fast, both North and South, you know, which is one of the things that will feed into the Emancipation Proclamation.
And it was becoming increasingly clear that it was not going to end.
It was not going to end anytime soon. And Lincoln, as I say, a very, very shrewd politician, he understood what some of our more recent ones haven't, that in a war, the number one weapon, or the number one military attribute is public sentiment. If the public turns against the war, you will not be able to win. Even no matter how many armies you have out there, no matter how much technology you have. If the public decides they don't want this war anymore, in a democracy certainly, you're not going to be able to fight the war and win the war. And so Lincoln is always trying to make sure that what he does brings public opinion along with him.
So how do you negotiate that? How do you please the Brooklyn Eagle and Horace Greeley? How do you make the emancipation fly?
Well, one thing is Lincoln, unlike President Obama, had a very strong majority in Congress. And so pretty much whatever he wanted passed by Congress, he could get. He had a Congress which was trying to work with him, not work against him. And he had a Republican Party, which was a major, you know, the political parties then were far more important in our politics than they are today. People were deeply devoted to their political party, and the party had, you know, it was a structure that existed all over the country. It was almost more prevalent than the government itself. And so the Republican Party is building up patriotic sentiment all over. But in Democratic areas, the so-called Copperheads, that's what the Republicans called them. Copperhead is a snake, right? A poisonous snake. They were whipping up hostility to the war effort. I mean, when the Democrats gained control of the Indiana legislature in the elections of 1862, they just said, forget it. We're not putting any money into this war. We're not even funding the government. It sounds like nowadays, right? We're not even funding the government of Indiana because we don't want this war. The government of Indiana had to operate on funds given to it by the War Department, which is probably illegal. But the governor was a strong Republican, and the Democrats in the legislature wouldn't give him any money, so the War Department gave him money to run the government and to be able to recruit troops and that kind of thing. So it was a difficult political situation.
Let's clarify copperheads, because actually I think it's actually a very difficult concept. So
Yeah.
a copperhead is a Northern Democrat, right?
Well, there are two kinds of Northern Democrats. There are the so-called war Democrats, who line up with the war and become. One of the things Lincoln does is he appoints as many Democrats as he can to be generals, and because he wants to bring Democrats along.
Yep.
So the war Democrats are people who, they are not for emancipation by and large, but they are for a vigorous war effort. Then there are these copperheads or peace Democrats, who, what they really believe is very vague. You know, some people say, no, they're traitors, they're pro-Confederate. Some of them were, but most of them were not. They just did not want the war. They thought they could have a negotiated settlement, and they certainly did not want emancipation. That was their number one thing. Their slogan was the Union as it was. The Union as it was in 1860. That means with slavery.
So to negotiate, or others would say capitulate to the South's desires, to return to the
negotiate
status quo.
and give them what they want, and then they'll come back in.
So we've got, on the Democratic side, we've got war Democrats and we've got the peace Democrats or copperheads. But there's also diversity within the Republican Party. So let's talk a little bit about what it meant to be a Republican.
Well, to make it too simple, there were three kinds: conservative, moderate, and radical. The radicals were for emancipation from the beginning. They were strong anti-slavery people. They had long histories of fighting against slavery. Many of them were really abolitionists, but the abolitionists worked outside of politics. These were guys who were working within the system. The radicals were not a majority of Congress, but in a time of crisis, people who have a clear plan, a clear policy, are going to get followers. Thaddeus Stevens, the great radical congressman, when Lincoln calls Congress into special session, Stevens gets up at the beginning of the war and he says, we are not going to win this war without emancipating all the slaves, arming black soldiers, occupying the South. People think there's going to be a simple war. No. Everyone said, this guy's crazy. But as time goes on, it begins to show he's right, actually. We are not winning the war fighting it on an old conventional basis. Maybe Stevens has a point, you know? So the radicals gain support just because the other policies are not working. That, you know, the moderates are people like Lincoln. They are anti-slavery, but they're pro-union. They are worried about the implications of emancipation, but they're strongly in favor of winning the war. And then there are some conservative Republicans, but they're a pretty small group within the party. They're mostly in these border states, the Kentucky and Maryland, and Lincoln has to worry about them for a while, but by 1862 he's getting fed up with the border states, and he decides he can't gear his policy around them.
Okay, so among this yes, sir.
Yes.
I'm a Quaker, and Quakers don't seem to fit into any of those categories.
Quakers.
Quakers make decisions by coming to agreement, so about 85 years before the Civil War, they agreed to be abolitionists.
Well, yeah, you're right, of course they did.
That their own members emancipated their slaves.
The Quakers were the first group to declare that if you could not be a Quaker and own slaves, absolutely.
But they were also pacifists.
And exactly, they were pacifists. What is that movie with, what is it, Gregory Peck or something with the Quakers? There's a movie about that. What? Friendly Persuasion.
So my question is...
I'm not saying that's historically accurate, but I'm just saying, yes.
So my question is, Quakers were very small in number.
Yeah.
Were they so small that anyone in that category
I don't think Quakers were a major political faction, basically. They were mostly in Pennsylvania. There were some in New York, not a lot. The Quakers were strong abolitionists, and before the Civil War, they had been very active in the Underground Railroad in assisting fugitive slaves who got into Pennsylvania, hiding them, helping them on their way. But they were pacifists. They were conscientious objectors. There were provisions for conscientious objectors in the Civil War. But I don't think the Quakers factored in all that much in this political spectrum we're showing, although I respect them enormously.
I would add a very interesting aside about Quakers. On the other side of this wall, we'll be opening an exhibit called In Pursuit of Freedom, which is about Brooklyn abolitionists. And some of the first Brooklyn abolitionists were black Brooklynites, free during a time when slavery was still very influential in Brooklyn. And the first black benevolent society that was established was actually named after a Quaker. It was the Brooklyn African Woolman Benevolent Society.
Right.
And Woolman was John Woolman. So they clearly, also represented a moment of interracial cooperation when such a thing was actually incredibly rare at the time.
I don't want to throw any rain on your parade, but the fact is, most Quakers were not abolitionists. Yeah. And as time went on, they actually, in the 19th century, they became more and more conservative, not because they were pro-slavery, but they were very alarmed by conflict of any kind. And in fact, vigorous abolitionists were expelled from the Quakers in the 1830s and 1840s. There are people here like Isaac Hopper, Abigail Hopper. These are Quakers who moved to New York and were expelled by the New York Quakers because they were vocal abolitionists. It was all right to keep it to yourself, but they were issuing pamphlets, and the official Quaker body, whatever it was called in New York, kicked them out because they were causing trouble. Quakers don't like trouble, maybe because they're pacifists. But unfortunately, to get rid of slavery, it would require a lot of trouble.
Which is part of our story.
Right.
So in this vibrant political and social world, let's do the blow by blow. Talk us through how the Emancipation Proclamation came to be signed.
How many hours do you have? I'll give you a very quick rundown. Number one, what I said before about Lincoln not wanting slavery to be an issue was true only for a little while. By the end of 1861, and nothing had happened in the war yet, there was one battle, Bull Run, which didn't amount to anything. Lincoln is already talking about getting some emancipation plan going. He goes to Delaware. I keep mentioning Delaware. He goes to Delaware, 1,800 slaves. What kind of institution is that? He says, look, Delaware, we got to get emancipation going. Delaware can have the glory of leading the way, of getting rid of slavery. And he gives them the plan. Now, this is not, as Julie said, Lincoln's plan at this point was nothing like the Emancipation Proclamation. The plan was, like gradual emancipation. It was a plan his great idol, Henry Clay, had been pushing in Kentucky for 50 years with no success. Gradual emancipation. Lincoln said it may take till 1900. Monetary compensation to the owners because they're losing recognized property.
An enormous value.
Yeah,
too.
Of great value. And colonization. That is, the freed people will, now Lincoln never said force them, but encourage them. The distinction may have been lost on these blacks. It's like Romney, remember in the campaign, said, well, the illegal immigrants, we won't deport them, they'll self-deport. We'll make their life so miserable that they'll leave voluntarily, right? So that, we're not, but colonization, we will get them to leave the country. And in fact, he said, I know a wonderful area in Central America with beautiful land and coal mines, and they can set up a wonderful colony there. It'll be great. Delaware says, forget it, we're not interested. Now, this is an important moment. Delaware, 1,800 slaves. Delaware will not accept this plan. If Delaware will not accept the most generous possible form of emancipation, you tell me how they're going to get rid of slavery in Alabama or Mississippi without a war. The Civil War was a horrible thing. Hundreds of thousands of people died. That's a terrible thing. And yet, I cannot see a peaceful scenario with any plausibility to getting rid of slavery in this country. And I think Delaware's decision is just a little index of that. Lincoln is not deterred. All through the spring of 1862, he's still pushing his plan. He goes to Kentucky, he goes to the border state, he calls in, he goes to Congress, pass constitutional amendments allowing this, pushing. Nothing happens. By the middle of 1862, the pressures on Lincoln for a new change of policy, have built up. First, the number one pressure is the war is a stalemate. They are not winning the war. They're not losing, they're not winning. It's a stalemate. And more people are saying, well, obviously we're not winning the old way. Maybe these radicals have a point. Slavery is we can't win the war as a war of army against army. We've got to make it a war against Southern society, so to speak. And many people who are not radicals are now pushing this. You know, if you look at in the Library of Congress, the Lincoln Papers, 20,000 letters received by Lincoln during his life. And in 1862, more and more letters from ordinary Northerners are saying things like, you know, I'm not an abolitionist, but it's obvious to me that you must attack slavery if you want to win this war. And Congress is also, the radicals are gaining in Congress. Congress moves forward. They abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. They pass confiscation acts, which actually offer freedom to a lot of slaves if they get to Union lines, which a lot of them can't do, of course. So, to make a long story short, Lincoln, the initial Emancipation Proclamation, one might almost say, was a little note that Lincoln presents to his cabinet in July 1862, in which he says, I am going to declare the slaves free in the South as a military measure. Just a sentence. And the cabinet is stunned, absolutely stunned. Even Secretary of the Treasury Chase, who is an abolitionist, says, oh my God, this is more than I've ever demanded. Chase thought military commanders should free slaves as they moved into areas. Secretary of State Seward says, who's also sort of an abolitionist, at least he's married to a very abolitionist woman who's always badgering him if he gets off the line. But Seward says, you know, you can't issue this now, because it will seem like an act of desperation, the last card of a losing player. You've got to wait for a military victory. Then you can issue it. And Lincoln says, you know, it's okay. That's a pretty good point. It's not until September when they win sort of a victory at Antietam. It's really a draw, but
it wasn't a loss.
It
which
wasn't
was more
a loss.
than
Well,
they could say for that summer.
Lee had to retreat out of it. So Antietam, by the way, is the bloodiest day in all of more Americans died on that one day of battle than on any other day in American history, more than on 9/11, more than the Battle of the Bulge or D-Day. It was a horrible, bloody battle. But Lee did have to retreat out of it. So Lincoln said this is a victory, and he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And if you look at the final one, you will see that it begins by quoting the preliminary one. The first 3 paragraphs are just recapitulating parts of the preliminary proclamation, which was issued, as he says, on September 22nd, 1862. It's a warning to the South. It doesn't free anybody. It says, if you guys don't stop fighting by January 1st, I'm going to free your slaves. On the other, what the implication of that is, if you do stop fighting, slavery will survive, right? So that's the key turning point in a sense. It now becomes, as we heard about with Obama and Syria, he drew a red line in the sand. Not everybody was convinced he would actually go forward with it, and especially after the elections, the fall elections in 1862, October and November, were a disaster for the Republican Party. Remember I said that they won the legislature of Indiana, the Democrats. They won a lot of other, they elected the governor of New York, Horatio Seymour. Many people blamed the proclamation for that. Many people said, the Democrats said, this will prolong the war. The South will never agree to negotiate if you declare their slaves are going to be free. So this proclamation is counterproductive. It will make the war go on forever. And many Northerners seem to have, they also used more lurid arguments about blacks pouring into the North, taking the jobs of white people, marrying their daughters, and all sorts of things like that. Political discourse was pretty low back then, believe me. So it was not clear whether this proclamation was really going to be issued or not. Some people thought Lincoln would retreat because of those elections.
During that unsure summer, one of the most fascinating stories, I think, from the period of time where Lincoln is sort of testing out this idea among various people. He's meeting with his cabinet. He's sort of testing it out with various other politicians. And one group that he meets up with is a group of black ministers, right? And
From Washington,
From
yeah.
Washington. So he invites them over, and he actually sells his colonization idea.
This is August 1862. He's already decided, but hasn't issued yet, and he has. Now, here is the irony. Lincoln is the first president ever to meet with black people. I'm not talking about slaves. There were slaves working in the White House. The first president ever to meet in the White House with black Americans as constituents or as people who were talking to. Later, not at this point, he meets a couple of times with Frederick Douglass. That's pretty well known. This meeting, and he actually met with a lot of others. When I was writing my book, I counted up. It was amazing how many blacks he met with at one time or another. But at this meeting, as Julie says, his plan was to sell colonization. He says to them, you must be free, absolutely. Slavery is the greatest injustice ever inflicted on any people. That's pretty strong. But he goes on to say, there is a prejudice against you here. You will never be able to achieve equality in this country. It is better, therefore, for us to be separated. He wants them to go out and propagandize among African American people for immigration. But most blacks say no. Just like Delaware said no, Kentucky said no to getting rid of slavery, most black Americans said no to immigration. They said, we are Americans. We have as much right to be here as you do. We are demanding our rights in this country. Lincoln sticks with this colonization thing all through the rest of 1862. In his message to Congress, one of the most brilliant documents in American history, or some parts of it, in December, what we now call the State of the Union address, except back then they just sent it in printed form. He didn't read it to Congress. I don't have the text here, but he ends up with this brilliance, that the dogmas of the past are not applicable to the present. We will be remembered. The fiery trial, that's where the title of my book comes from. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in history, And he talks about freeing the slaves. Giving freedom to the slaves secures their freedom and our freedom, the nation's freedom. But before that, he has this long disquisition on colonization, why it's a good idea, how you're going to pay for it, issue a whole cockamamie scheme of issuing bonds to pay for colonization, and European immigrants will come in and pay off, their work will pay off the bonds. European immigrants are going to come in to pay off the cost of getting blacks out of the country. It's a crazy idea. So he sticks with it into December 1862, even though he has little support in Congress, he has little support from African Americans, and he has little support from the border slave states.
Now, I think I bring up that delegation of black ministers because, if you read, actually, Professor Foner has a great sort of description of it in his book, how this meeting goes down, and you read it, your reaction is, this guy has some nerve. He's basically like, you should leave.
Right.
You should all leave. It's shocking, and it makes me wonder, my question is this what he feels, or is this public relations? Is this, because all of these meetings
How
were then
could you
reported
how
back
could you
in
know?
the press.
But you could ask that about any politician, any statement, right? I think my conclusion about Lincoln is you have to take him at his word. There are plenty of scholars who dismiss this and say, no, Lincoln couldn't have believed that. How could the great Lincoln have believed that? Another approach is to ignore it. If you read, I just mentioned her because she made so much money off her book that it doesn't matter what I say, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals. That's a, 800-page book. Take a look at the index and see if colonization is in there. There's one sentence. Oh, yeah, Lincoln was talking about colonization. But why? Doris knows that that's out there. You think she didn't know that he meant that? It doesn't fit the image of the great emancipator, so she leaves it out. But that's not good history. We tell our graduate students, right? You can't just leave out the evidence that doesn't comport with your predetermined theory, right? You might have to rethink your assumptions. For 10 years, from 1852 to 1862, Lincoln was promoting this idea of colonization. Lincoln was on the board of directors of the Illinois Colonization Society in the 1850s. I think you have to assume that this is something he believed in. Why? But the question is, why? Why believe that? The first thing to remember is a lot of people believed it then. Henry Clay, I mentioned, Jefferson, Andrew Jackson. Most of the major political leaders of this time talked about colonizing blacks outside the country. Now, it's a deeply racist idea at its core. It says America is a country for white people, and blacks are kind of an alien group who are not really part of the American people. But one has to remember that colonization is part of a plan for ending slavery. Before the Civil War, here, I will give you a very oversimplified statement. There are three ways of ending slavery. One, individual manumission of slaves. That's actually how it pretty much ended in Delaware. So many people freed their slaves that there are only 1,800 left, so this institution is almost gone. But that doesn't, people freed their slaves, but not enough in most places to end slavery. Second is laws. Slavery is created by state laws. You can pass laws anywhere. That's what happened in New York. It happened in Massachusetts, and et cetera. You can only do that where the slave owners don't have enough power to block it, right? But in the South, the slave owners have all the power. So you've got to make emancipation acceptable. You've got to get the cooperation of slave owners if you're going to do it through a legal process. That's why there are these two carrots. One is compensation, monetary compensation, and the other is colonization. Because these slave owners do not, as Julie said, do not want a large population of free Negroes around after slavery ends. So now, there is a third mode of ending slavery. Military emancipation, right? That had happened many times in history. People knew about it. It wasn't a big secret. The first Emancipation Proclamation in American history was not issued by Lincoln. It was issued by Lord Dunmore, the British commander in Virginia in 1775, when the colonists were riled up and rebelling. And Lord Dunmore didn't have a lot of soldiers. And he said, all right, you guys are out of hand. Any slave who comes and joins my army is free. Why did Lord Dunmore do that? Was Lord Dunmore an abolitionist? No, of course not. He did it to weaken the other side. This happened all the time. In the wars of the Caribbean, the French offered freedom to Spanish slaves. The Spanish offered freedom to English slaves. You always, in a war, you always offer freedom to the slaves of your enemy. Everyone knew that. That's what this is. Military emancipation. As he says at the very end, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. I don't denigrate it for that. I'm saying that is a mode of emancipation. The army is going to emancipate. The army will go in and free these slaves or protect the freedom of these slaves. It's a measure to win the war. So that's what the emancipation, but that means all those other plans are irrelevant now. After the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln never mentions colonization again, because this doesn't seek the cooperation of slave owners. This tells the slave owners, sorry guys, your slaves are free, I don't care what you think. So colonization is now irrelevant. It's part of an other plan that is no longer in operation.
To borrow Professor Foner's term, it was the emancipation of slaves, but also the emancipation of Lincoln himself.
Right, Lincoln emancipated himself from his old ideas. This is completely different. It's immediate, not gradual, right? There is nothing in here about compensation to the owners. This property is abrogated with, this is one of the, they didn't do this in the French Revolution. Abrogate so much property. This was the slaves were by far the largest concentration of property in the United States. You want to know why there was a civil war? I'll tell you. The slaves, just the 4 million slaves as property, they were people, but they were also property, were worth about $4 billion in 1860 money. All the banks, railroads, and factories in the United States put together were worth $3.5 billion. The slaves were worth more than all the banks, railroads, and factories in the United States.
And
You
we're
tell me
freed.
who's going to give that up
And
without a war.
But we're freed without compensation.
And
that's
that
a
4
remarkable
billion,
thing.
and that's 4 billion 1860,
That's
not,
right,
you know,
yeah.
that's just abrogated.
All right, so
This lady over there had a question.
yes.
Documentation says that that was effective. What happened in a state like Texas, where slavery did not end for another year after that document?
Could you repeat that? I didn't quite hear. What is the, Texas, I understood you were talking about, but, yeah.
You mentioned it being effective immediately. In a state like Texas, where that wasn't effective
well,
immediately,
yeah,
that it lasted
that's
like
a very,
year.
very good question. The proclamation is effective where the Union Army goes. It says right at the beginning somewhere, no, not at the beginning, on the top of the back page, the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. In other words, wherever the Army goes, part of its job now is to secure the freedom of these slaves. But there's a lot of the Confederacy where the Union Army isn't at this point. They never get to Texas. They never get into Texas during the war. So the proclamation is inapplicable during the war. In Texas, they have this holiday called Juneteenth, right? June 19th. Why? That's the day the Union Army lands. They got there late. The war's over, but they got there. June 19th, 1865, and the general, I can't remember his name, issues a proclamation saying, okay, we're here, and we're here to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, so you guys got to realize slavery is abolished in Texas. So slavery is abolished in Texas by the Emancipation Proclamation, but slavery is effectively abolished in Texas when the Union Army gets there to enforce abolition. So that goes back to Julie's point. Emancipation comes at different times in different places.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point out that Texas is very deep in, but in places like, say, North Carolina, you actually have a very vibrant conversation going on between enslaved people on different plantations. People going to the Union lines, hearing about Emancipation Proclamation, getting proof of it, and then coming back and sharing that story around. So again, I would emphasize the agency of enslaved people themselves in literally spreading the word, often at risk of their own lives.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Wait, let's have the, yeah.
Did Lincoln favor colonization because he thought that blacks intellectually wouldn't survive in the Union? What was his personal feelings?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. You know, Lincoln, there have been many thousands of books written about Lincoln, including mine, and many, many others. But Lincoln remains elusive to us. He was a very private man. He didn't reveal himself. Lincoln did not keep a diary. Lincoln did not write many letters. The whole collected works of Lincoln is 7 volumes, which is mostly speeches. The collected works of Jefferson is over 100 volumes, and they haven't even gotten to his presidency. He's always writing letters. Jefferson's the opposite problem. He believed everything. You can find all beliefs of Jefferson. Lincoln, it's hard to know. He didn't confide in people. What are his real beliefs? I think Lincoln said the reason that black people should leave the United States up until 1863, as I say, he drops that once the proclamation is issued, is not that they're inferior. He never says black people, unlike Jefferson, he never says black people are inferior in any way. The most he said, even when he says, I am not in favor of them having political rights and that kind of thing, the most he will say, he says, they're not equal. No, they're not equal. They're not equal in color, for example. Well, what the hell does that mean? He doesn't say they're not equal intellectually, culturally, nothing like that, whereas Jefferson does. So what are his racial views? Lincoln is a man of the 19th century. He grew up among Southerners. He is a Southerner. He was born in Kentucky. I think Lincoln shared many of the prejudices of his era, and yet he was not a visceral racist. He didn't mind meeting with black people. You know, I mean, in 1862, for the first time, Congress extends diplomatic recognition to Haiti, right? First time, 50 years, 60 years after the Haitian Revolution. Democrats are appalled. They say, Lincoln, how can you have that? They're going to send a black ambassador. Can you believe that? Lincoln says, I don't care if they send a black ambassador. What do I care what kind of ambassador they send? Lincoln doesn't care if he has to meet a black ambassador. What does that mean? Frederick Douglass, who met with Lincoln, mostly to hector him and tell him, you got to do this.
Successfully hector him.
Yeah, but he came out and he said, you know, I didn't feel any difference of race. He treated me like a man. He treated me like an equal. So, but I actually think that meeting with people like Frederick Douglass changes Lincoln's racial outlook a little bit. He had never met, you know, there weren't any blacks where he was living in Illinois, hardly. He had never met any politically active, articulate, you know, he had a black barber or something, but by the end of the Civil War, he has met very talented, intelligent, articulate black people, and I think his view has changed. You know, it has. By the end of the Civil War, he's talking about giving the right to vote to some black people, which is something they'd never said before the war.
I want to steer us towards after the document was signed, because we're still actually before it. Let's talk about some of the consequences and the legacies.
I want to point out
of the
one
document.
thing, and then we can do that if you don't mind.
All right.
Because Lincoln is one of the joys of writing about Lincoln is he had such a brilliant command of the language. To read Lincoln is so interesting and moving and, you know, just dramatic. But you must read very, very carefully. He chose his words with extreme care. The idea that he wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope, that is ridiculous. That's not how Lincoln worked. He was a very careful writer. And by the way, he didn't have speech writers. He didn't have spin doctors. He did it all himself. But this, even I, who, you know, I've taught this for years and years, when I was working my book, I saw things in the proclamation I had never actually seen before, because I didn't read them. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. On the back page, the first full paragraph, and I hereby enjoin. When Lincoln issued the preliminary proclamation, some people said, "My God, they're going to massacre the white people. They're going to ride. Lincoln is calling for racial warfare in the South. They're going to rise up like in Haiti." All right. So Lincoln adds this thing: I enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence. He could have left it right there, but he doesn't. He says, unless in necessary self-defense. They have a right to defend their freedom even with violence. He didn't have to say that.
That is remarkable.
And then continue that sentence. I recommend to them that in all cases, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. Reasonable wages, not just wages. The word reasonable. Why did he put the word reasonable in there? They have a right to judge whether the wages being offered to them are reasonable or not. And if they're not reasonable, they don't have to accept them. In other words, in this sentence, Lincoln is addressing the slaves as people, not as property. As people with volition, with judgment. They are historical actors in this drama. I never really recognized that before until I studied. And then go to the next sentence, which is critical to the proclamation. Such persons will be received into the armed service. This is the first time the government says, yes, blacks can now enlist in the army. And that is one of the key reasons Lincoln drops colonization, I think. Putting them in the army is an entirely different concept than saying you got to leave the country. And by the end of the war, something like 200,000 black men have served in the Union Army and Navy, and they...
Which is 1/5.
1/10. 10%.
10%.
2 million altogether served, 200,000 black.
No, but it is 1/5 of the black population that was
Oh,
eligible.
of the black population of that
20%
age.
of black
Yeah.
black men able to fight fought. I mean, that's a remarkable number.
Yeah. Lincoln comes to believe that fighting for the Union gives them a claim to citizenship. And by the way, many people come to believe that. By the end of the war, many, many Northerners, one of the things we must realize is that racism is part of history and has a history. It is not always the same. I really believe that racism wanes in the last year or two of the Civil War in the North as people come to appreciate the service of black soldiers. The Emancipation Proclamation, even though politically inexpedient when it was issued, becomes to give the war a moral meaning. When you have so much death and destruction, you want to have a feeling that there's some transcendent value here. And emancipation becomes essential to the meaning of the war, And I think it changes Lincoln's views, too. The argument of my book, which I should say, since we live in a capitalistic society,
I was going to do that.
It's on sale out there, is simply that Lincoln grew. Lincoln changed. There is no one essential Lincoln. The Lincoln at the moment he died is a very different man in terms of his attitudes on all these things than the man at the beginning of the war or in the 1850s, et cetera. So that's what we have to trace out.
We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to pose a question to Professor Foner and then also turn it to all of you. What relevance does this document have on our lives today? As Americans, as New Yorkers, as Brooklynites, how does this affect who we are?
Well, I think, in many ways, this is one of the great turning points in American history, even though slavery doesn't end on that one day, obviously. I think it is the first time in our history, this nation was born in as William Lloyd Garrison said, a covenant with the devil. This nation was born in slavery, and slavery was essential to our national existence for a long, long time. This is the first time that the government of the United States severs itself from the institution of slavery. And that, and it doesn't settle the issue. Let's put it this way. It puts slavery on the road to being abolished. That settles the question eventually of slavery. But it also opens another question, which is still with us, and that is, what is going to be the status of these 4 million people? Once you say they are staying here, they are not leaving the country, then you have to say, what are their rights going to be? Are they going to be equal to everyone else? Are they going to be a subordinate group? Are they going to be citizens? That's the question we're still concerned with today. So the proclamation leaves that question on the national agenda, but you can't debate that question until slavery is ended, so to speak.
It's interesting because I think maybe offering a slightly more negative view, I also think that there are consequences in the limitations of the document. You know, I think Professor Foner's made a really good argument for why this had to be a war measure, how Lincoln's background shaped it in his own evolution, but I wonder if there are consequences and legacies in the limitations of the language,
Yeah,
in the
that's a good
in the
point.
fact that there was contingency in the way that people were freed, and those kinds of contingencies continue to sort of haunt us even into the 20th
it
and
is
21st
not
centuries.
what the abolitionist movement, which was a small group but of very principled people, believed that the way to end slavery was not through war, not through law even, through a moral awakening of the nation. Their strategy was what they call moral suasion. Convince the nation that slavery is wrong, and then it will be abolished. Lydia Maria Child, a wonderful abolitionist writer, at the end of the war said, the problem is that slavery was ended not by a moral awakening, but by a miserable military necessity.
She said it was done reluctantly and stintedly, and that even the degree that was accomplished was done selfishly. She was very critical of Lincoln.
Well, the abolitionists were always critical of Lincoln. He was not an abolitionist. He never claimed to be an abolitionist. On the other hand, Lincoln had this incredible quality of, which we don't really see in most of our political leaders, of having a very thick skin. He didn't mind people criticizing him. He met with these guys. He met with Wendell Phillips. He met with Douglas. He knew all they were going to do was badger him about all the mistakes he was making, but he liked to hear that. He liked to hear opposing views, alternative views. He didn't think he had all the he had humility. Let me put it that way. Humility, that is a quality lacking in our political leaders of all parties. Humility. Lincoln had it, and that is what enabled him to change and move. So you cannot take even the proclamation and say that fixes Lincoln. I think by the end of his life, his views, read the second inaugural address. It's very, very different from the proclamation. It's a rumination on what the legacy of slavery is for this nation, you know, something that no president has ever actually addressed in our history. You know, we talk about slavery, but we don't really like to confront it as something deeply, deeply embedded into our history. Lincoln talked about that in the second inaugural. Pretty remarkable speech.
Which unfortunately, we don't
don't
read
have
as
it
much
here.
as we read the Emancipation Proclamation. Sir, please, I'm going to have a microphone come over to you.
Professor, did the example of John Brown shape Lincoln's thoughts over a period of time to any extent? And secondly, what is John Brown's legacy for us?
Well, John Brown, I guess, was trying to implement there was a fourth way of ending slavery I didn't mention, and that was by slave revolution. That happened in Haiti, but nowhere else. John Brown was trying to set off a slave revolution. Lincoln was not a follower of John Brown. Lincoln said in the great Cooper Union speech just up the road here in February 1860, a few months after John Brown's raid, Lincoln said this was such a crazy plan that even the slaves, uneducated as they were, did not join him. They realized that this plan could never work. So, you know, but Lincoln also said it is slavery that produces, as long as there's slavery, there's going to be John Browns. There are going to be people wanting to get rid of slavery in all sorts of ways. I think John Brown, whatever one thinks of him, raises a fundamental issue for our society and every other society, which is, what do you do when confronted with a terrible moral evil? You know, Lincoln knew slavery was a terrible moral evil, but he didn't know what to do about it before the Civil War. He said, I don't know what to do about it. He said, I cannot foresee what's going to happen. Do you just accommodate it? Do you compromise? Do you try to gradually, or do you use violence to confront it? You know, that's a moral dilemma that people in all sorts of societies face. So John Brown raises that question in the most direct way.
Let's, sir, in the blue.
What I always wondered about was Lincoln's urgency about saving the Union, and what was so important about that it didn't matter what happened to slavery. And I finally begin to see the historical context of that, and it comes out in the Gettysburg Address that at that time this was the noble experiment in democracy, and you had to preserve the country in order to preserve this model.
Yeah, I
And
think that's precisely what Lincoln believed. One of the few revealing letters he wrote in 1855 was to his friend Joshua Speed, who was a slave owner in Kentucky, where Lincoln recalled a time they had seen a bunch of slaves being taken on a boat to St. Louis to be sold in a market. And Lincoln wrote, again, I don't have the exact words here, he said, you know, that sight was a torment to me, and I see things like it all the time. You ought to realize, he says, how much the northern people crucify our feelings in order to maintain our loyalty to the Union. The feeling is anti-slavery, but he's willing to, and in that letter later on he says, I hate to see fugitive slaves hunted down, but I bite my lip and keep silent. Why does he keep silent? Well, as you say, because Lincoln, like many, many people then and now, believed that the United States was a sort of exemplar of democracy, of self-government, in a world of tyrannies. Now, I hasten to add, Lincoln did not believe in manifest destiny. He opposed the Mexican War. He did not believe, like some of our recent presidents, that the way to spread democracy is go around just invading other countries and say, here it is, whether you want it or not, democracy. No, that's not the idea, said Lincoln. The idea is perfect our own society, prove by example that our system is superior. That makes a terrible dilemma. He understands that slavery undermines this mission. Why should anyone listen to us? He says, we are hypocrites. We are seen as hypocrites. We talk about freedom. We have millions of slaves. Why should anyone in the world listen to us? On the other hand, to allow the Union to be broken up will destroy this last bastion of democracy. But let us remember, Lincoln could have easily avoided war in the winter of 1860-61 by giving in to the South. And there were plenty in the North who wanted them to do that. The merchants across the river here, probably a few in Brooklyn too, many of them had very close ties with the South. They chartered a special train to go down to Washington in December 1860 to beg Congress to give in to the South. Give them what they want and they'll stay here. Merchants are not the most courageous types. Lincoln said no. He torpedoed compromise. We had a civil war because Lincoln torpedoed compromise. What does that tell us? He wants to save the Union, but he is not willing to give up his principle at that point to save the Union. He says, I want to save the Union, but it must be a Union worth saving. So, you know, the Union is not the only issue for him, as we sometimes think.
Hi, Professor. I was a couple weeks ago teaching emancipation, but I teach AP World History, and I was teaching the emancipation of the serfs in
Right,
Russia,
right,
and Tsar
right.
Alexander. And I was wondering, I know that Alexander exchanged letters with Lincoln, and people like Horace Greeley were talking about, how the fact that, you have this autocratic government that was able to free slaves, and even though Alexander did compensate the surfers, if you will, to what extent did that have an influence on Lincoln? Do we know?
I don't know that it had an influence exactly, but Lincoln was aware of the liberation of the serfs in Russia. Of course, as you well know, it's a very different system, and it's a very different liberation. They still remain on the land and this kind of thing, but still, it was, and there were far more serfs than tens of millions of them, right? Lincoln was aware of it. Lincoln wrote to the American ambassador to Russia at one point was a guy named Bayard Taylor, who was a well-known writer and lecturer. And when he got back in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln wrote him a letter and said, why don't you go around giving lectures on the emancipation of the serfs and tell people how successful it is? He wanted to use this in order to help bolster support for emancipation in the United States. I don't think it influenced him, but he was aware of it, and he, understood that in a certain sense they were all in the same boat in moving forward in a certain way.
Go ahead. I'm going to give you the microphone.
Is there any significance to be drawn from Lincoln's visit to listen to Henry Ward Beecher preach at Plymouth Church in 1860? And number two, Beecher went to England after that on a preaching tour to preach against slavery. Do you know if that was done with Lincoln's support?
To the former,
Go ahead. You know more about Beecher than I do.
I'm turning over here to Preeti. Are you here? Didn't we figure out that Lincoln never came to Beecher's church? Lincoln, right?
You mean when he was here in
When
1860?
he came in 1860, he did not actually end up coming to hear a Beecher preach at Plymouth Church. So that is a little bit of a
Lincoln
a
didn't
common
like
myth.
to go to church. He was the only president. He's the only president we've ever had who was never a member of a church in his entire life. He could definitely not get elected nowadays.
And in fact, there is a statue on Plymouth Church of Lincoln praying there, which is fiction.
A lot of what we see is fiction.
Yeah.
I wrote a newspaper that said that Lincoln was scheduled to come back to Plymouth Church
He was.
He
to
was,
deliver the Cooper Union address at Plymouth Church.
yes, he was scheduled to, and he actually never made it across the river.
Wasn't the original
Yeah.
lecture supposed to be in Brooklyn?
Yes. And
then
it was too big.
It was too big,
and
so
so
they
it got
moved it
moved to
over to
Cooper
Cooper
Institute.
Union.
Yeah.
Ice on the river is the reason.
Yeah, which is another story about the Brooklyn Bridge and why it was built.
I want to thank you for giving this lecture. It's very informative. Thank you. Although the slave owners, they were offered at one point compensation for their property, were the people that were enslaved, were they offered compensation for the 300 or 400 years they were?
Well, that is a great question, of course. And the answer to that is no, as you, I'm sure, know. Now, in the second inaugural, Lincoln does not talk about compensation, reparation, whatever you want to call it. He does say that it may be the will of God that he basically says this war is a punishment to the entire nation, not just the South, for the sin of the evil of slavery. And even though we want the war to end, it may be God's will that the war continue until all the wealth piled up by the slaves 250 years of what he calls unrequited toil, unpaid labor, all that wealth may have to be destroyed. That's not compensation, that's the opposite. That may be the divine punishment on the nation, the destruction of everything the slaves have created, the scales of justice that way. Now, after the war, many liberated slaves, you've heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule, they said, we deserve compensation. Exactly, not the owners, we deserve compensation. We have done the work, we have built this place up, we have tilled the land and cleared the forests. We want land, we deserve land. For complicated reasons, it didn't happen, of course. But Lincoln was dead by the time that became a public issue, so it's impossible to know what he would have said about it.
Hello, good afternoon. I had a question since I was young. I'm 59 years old now. My question is, in New York, at that time, I think it was called Amsterdam, right? New York City.
New Amsterdam.
Yeah. I'd like to know how many slaves was in New York City, the five boroughs, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, Bronx, at
How
that
many
time.
slaves?
At that time.
At which point? I mean,
1862.
well, there were none. Slavery had been abolished in New York State by 1827. In the colonial era, in the 18th century, Manhattan and Brooklyn had a lot of slaves. This was the largest concentration of slaves north of the Mason-Dixon line. It wasn't a plantation system like in Virginia and South Carolina, but many of the farms in Brooklyn had a few slaves.
Yes.
Many of the craftsmen in Manhattan had slaves working with them. Many rich people had slaves working in their homes. Slavery was pretty ensconced in. Now, it was not our friend Ira Berlin, distinguishes between a society with slaves and a slave society. A slave society is one where slavery is the fundamental economic institution. That was not the case here. This was a society with slaves. It's easy to abolish then because you're not overturning the whole economic system.
And I'll add that, so this idea about a society with slaves versus a slave society, recently we've been thinking about Brooklyn in some ways as actually perhaps the slave society.
Closer to a slave
across
society.
the river from a society with slaves.
Right. Brooklyn had a lot of slaves, no
And
question
because
about
it was an agricultural region, it was much more reliant on slave labor than the mercantile city across the river. It was this breadbasket that was creating the food that was actually fueling the growth of the city across the river. So it's one thing that we really do forget about Brooklyn's history is not just that there was slavery, that it raged on in Brooklyn right until the bitter end.
I like, you have an idea how many? You said like 4 million. How many you think was in New York?
It's a good question. I don't know all the numbers, but around 1790 in Brooklyn, about 30% of the population was of African descent, and that was mainly, all but a handful of people were enslaved. So it was a very large population.
I think at the peak of slavery in New York State or New York Colony, there might have been 50,000 slaves, 30, 40, 50, somewhere in that range. It's not like South Carolina, but it is a pretty substantial system, and it took a long time to get rid of it. We have to probably end in a minute.
Let's take one more question right here, sir.
Is there any evidence bearing in mind that Mary Lincoln had two brothers fighting for the Confederate cause?
Could I ask you to talk into the mic, please?
Bearing in mind that Mary Lincoln had two brothers, stepbrothers, fighting for the Confederate cause, is there any evidence that the slowness of Lincoln to come around to the Emancipation Proclamation might have been from the influence of Mary, having
No,
come from Kentucky?
quite the reverse. Mary Lincoln gets a bum rap in the literature. I think the more you elevate one person up onto a big pedestal, the more someone else has to be down below. And so many of the Lincolnites, they despise Mary. She made his life miserable. She was always badgering him. She maxed out her credit card. I mean, come on. It's the Mary Lincolns who keep our economy going. Mary Lincoln, and by the way, that's what she called herself. She did not call herself Mary Todd Lincoln. She called herself Mary Lincoln. She was very devoted to her husband. She was a very savvy person. She was very knowledgeable about politics. Her father had been a fairly significant political figure in Kentucky. They lived just down the road from Henry Clay. He used to come around and have dinner with them. She knew American politics very well. And it is absolutely true that some of her relatives were fighting for the Confederacy, absolutely. And her father was a slave owner, even though the Upper South was full of people like Jefferson, Clay, Todd, slave owners who hated slavery but couldn't figure out how to do anything about it. But she was anti-slavery, absolutely. If anything, I would think she was pushing him toward emancipation, not against. And certainly, she would never, ever contradict her husband's political actions. If Mary Lincoln were alive today, she would be running. You couldn't do that in the mid-19th century, right? A woman could not run. She'd be like Hillary Clinton today. She'd be running for high office, not doing it through a husband.
As a historian of women and gender, I find the relationship and the comparisons of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln to be fascinating, because we've just heard for the last hour and a half about how Abraham Lincoln is this incredibly complex man, and ultimately, we're celebrating that complexity. And this is an incredibly complex woman who dealt with unbelievable grief in her life, and she is, by and large, portrayed in largely negative ways, and that's something that we should think about.
Well, I think it's just, I don't know, so many people, I think they had a pretty pleasant marriage for the mid-19th century. They had 2 children die very young. Her husband was shot sitting next to her in the theater. That can make you upset.
That's tough.
But, all right, anyway, so that's Mary Todd Lincoln.
Professor Foner, thank you so much for coming.
Okay, thank you all for coming.